The woman known as Go-Sakuramachi was born in 1740 into the imperial household of Kyoto, at a time when the Japanese throne was less a seat of command than a symbol of continuity. She was the daughter of Emperor Sakuramachi, who had ruled during a period when real authority rested with the Tokugawa shogunate in Edo. Her mother, Konoe Hisaku, came from one of the most powerful aristocratic families, the Konoe branch of the Fujiwara clan, whose lineage had long supplied consorts and regents to the court. Her birth placed her within a dynasty whose survival had come to depend on careful ritual and controlled appearances. Go-Sakuramachi grew up in a palace defined by ceremony, where her education was shaped not by the needs of governance, but by the preservation of culture, etiquette, and sacred authority. As a young princess, she was surrounded by the strict rhythms of court life. The imperial family no longer directed armies or influenced policy, but it remained the keeper of ancient rites, the calendar of religious observances, and the legitimacy that bound the shogunate to the past. Within this environment, Go-Sakuramachi was trained in poetry, classical literature, and ritual recitation. Her role was intended to be ornamental, one among the many women of the court whose presence reinforced continuity rather than change. Yet the fragility of succession meant that every child of the imperial line carried potential weight, even those not initially positioned to inherit the throne. Her childhood unfolded during a delicate stage for the dynasty. The imperial court in Kyoto had seen its influence shrink as the Tokugawa regime entrenched itself in Edo. Funding for the palace was dependent on the shogunate's allowance, and the court's activities were tightly regulated to prevent any assertion of independent power. In such a setting, daughters of emperors were expected to embody the dignity of the throne without ever challenging the order that kept them sidelined. Go-Sakuramachi grew up watching the reality that imperial titles no longer commanded armies or dictated law. They survived by representing unbroken lineage, a continuity the shogunate could not replace but would not allow to expand. Her father's reign lasted only a decade, and his early death in 1750 left the throne to a brother, Emperor Momozono. For Go-Sakuramachi, this change reinforced her position as a supporting figure within the dynasty. The young emperor carried the hopes of succession, and her role was to serve as a dutiful sister, part of a family that existed under constant observation. The shogunate monitored imperial marriages and offspring, and every birth or death within the household became a political calculation. The young princess would have understood early that her future depended not only on personal choice, but on the needs of a system determined to control succession. In the palace, the world was defined by ritual corridors and symbolic gestures. But beyond Kyoto, the realities of Japan in the mid-18th century were shifting. The shogunate faced fiscal difficulties, natural disasters, and unrest among the peasantry. The imperial court, while detached from direct governance, still represented an anchor of legitimacy. Go-Sakuramachi's childhood therefore prepared her for an existence where her own life would always be measured against the needs of an institution older than any government in power. When her brother assumed the throne, it was expected that succession would continue smoothly through him and his children. Go-Sakuramachi remained in the background, a daughter of the late emperor, respected, but without the prospect of sovereignty. Her training reflected this. She was immersed in the practices of court poetry, the study of Chinese classics, and the rituals that defined the yearly cycle. She was expected to maintain composure, learn the forms of communication suited to the court's delicate hierarchy, and live in a world of careful restraint. These skills were not those of command, but they shaped a quiet authority that would one day matter more than anyone anticipated. The early death of her father and the fragility of her brother's health underscored the precariousness of succession. Go-Sakuramachi's place as an imperial daughter meant that her presence was always a safeguard in reserve, even if unspoken. In a system where heirs could die young and branches of the family could weaken, women of the dynasty were sometimes called upon to preserve the continuity of rule. The 17th and 18th centuries had already seen several empresses ascend under such circumstances. Yet each time, their reigns were treated as temporary measures, tolerated only until a male heir could take the throne. Go-Sakuramachi grew up under the shadow of this precedent. She was trained not to expect power, yet her education in ritual and literature meant she could embody the court's ideals if called upon. She observed the way the shogunate kept the imperial house contained, providing funds for ceremonies while restricting independent influence. She understood that any role she might play would not be one of political initiative, but of preserving the throne's symbolic continuity. These lessons, absorbed in youth, would later shape the way she navigated a reign she had not sought but could not refuse. The palace halls where she was raised were filled with attention that was not spoken aloud. The rituals continued with precision, the poetry contests flourished, and the appearance of harmony was sustained. Yet every illness, every death within the imperial line reminded the court that succession was fragile. The young princess who became Go-Sakuramachi carried this awareness with her. She learned to see herself not as an individual set apart from history, but as part of a chain whose survival depended on obedience, silence, and readiness. The years of her childhood prepared her for a throne she was never expected to occupy, a throne she would one day inherit as the last woman ever permitted to reign. Emperor Momozono died in 1762 at the age of 21, leaving behind a young daughter and a son still in infancy. His death, though not entirely unexpected due to his poor health, sent tremors through the imperial court. The Chrysanthemum Throne had once again arrived at a moment of uncertainty, and the question of succession became immediate. There was no adult male heir who could assume the role without causing procedural and symbolic disruption. The court, already fragile in its political standing, was wary of suggesting any solution that might provoke interference or suspicion from the Tokugawa shogunate, whose grip on national governance had remained firm for over a century and a half. In Edo, the shogun's advisors kept a close watch on the inner workings of the Kyoto court, ensuring that no imperial maneuver could be interpreted as overreach. Within this tension, the idea of placing a woman on the throne was revived, not out of ideological acceptance, but out of necessity. The precedent existed. Empress Meisho had ruled in the previous century, and others before her had done the same under similarly constrained circumstances. But each time, the reign of a woman had been presented as temporary, a bridge between two legitimate male sovereigns. Go-Sakuramachi, now in her early 20s, was unmarried, childless, and widely regarded as disciplined and studious. She was known for her precise conduct and deep knowledge of court customs. She had no political base of her own and no ambitions beyond the rituals she had been raised to perform. These qualities made her a suitable choice in the eyes of the ministers, someone who could maintain the throne's continuity without threatening to disrupt the delicate balance of symbolic power between Kyoto and Edo. The shogunate was not eager to endorse a female ruler, but neither was it prepared to allow the imperial seat to remain vacant. Any delay in succession risked appearing as institutional weakness. The Tokugawa regime depended on the illusion of imperial stability to legitimize its own authority, and so, through coordinated negotiation and cautious approval, the proposal moved forward. Behind closed doors, imperial ministers prepared the groundwork for her enthronement. It would be the 10th time in Japanese history that a woman formally reigned, and no one could say with certainty whether it would be the last. Go-Sakuramachi did not request the crown. There are no records of protest, but neither are there signs of ambition. Her acceptance of the role reflected the logic of duty that defined her life. She understood the history, the risks, and the weight of precedent. She knew that every act under her reign would be watched and measured not only by Kyoto, but by the shogunate in Edo. To rule, even symbolically, under such conditions required more than ceremonial fluency. It required restraint, patience, and an unwavering sense of place within a system that had grown accustomed to silencing imperial will. Preparations for her accession unfolded under tight supervision. The enthronement rituals, though reduced from their ancient grandeur due to budgetary constraints and political caution, were carried out with the necessary symbolism. She became Empress Regnant Go-Sakuramachi, adopting a posthumous title that honored her father while situating her reign within a lineage that emphasized continuity over change. Her new role came with formal authority over court affairs, but real decisions remained under the shogunate's approval. Even the texts announcing her reign were crafted to appear neutral, emphasizing the necessity of her elevation rather than any notion of autonomous power. Among the courtiers, opinions were split. Some saw her as a capable steward, a vessel through which the dynasty might endure until a male heir came of age. Others feared that placing a woman on the throne would reignite debates about legitimacy, especially if her reign extended longer than expected. The ministers who had supported her appointment understood that stability was more valuable than purity of precedent. In their view, the throne needed a body, someone who could perform the rituals, recite the edicts, and represent imperial continuity. Go-Sakuramachi's presence, though not preferred, was necessary. In the shogunate's records, her ascension was treated as routine, a footnote in the broader machinery of Tokugawa administration. But in Kyoto, the meaning was more personal, more symbolic. The court, though stripped of political control, still held the weight of history. With her accession, the centuries-old imperial line once again relied on a woman to carry it forward, even if only temporarily. She would rule not as a challenge to the system, but as a safeguard within it. Her reign began not with ceremony alone, but with quiet restraint, shaped by the pressures of succession and the silent negotiations between a fractured court and a watchful regime. Go-Sakuramachi's enthronement in 1762 was not the beginning of sovereign rule, but the formal continuation of imperial survival under constraint. The court she inherited was ceremonial, not executive. Its rituals were upheld with precision, but the authority behind them had long since been rechanneled to the Tokugawa shogunate. From the moment her reign began, every action she took passed through layers of oversight. Official court appointments, religious observances, and state proclamations required review or tacit permission from Edo. Even within the palace walls, her decisions were shaped not only by tradition, but by the expectations of a government that governed from afar, yet hovered over Kyoto with deliberate attentiveness. The early years of her reign were spent navigating this invisible boundary between appearance and autonomy. The imperial court had long been reduced to a symbolic institution, reliant on stipends from the shogunate and deprived of military or fiscal power. Yet Go-Sakuramachi held a position that still commanded respect. Her presence at seasonal ceremonies, imperial rituals, and public audiences carried the weight of centuries. The paradox of her reign was that she was at once the highest symbolic authority in the land and among the most carefully controlled. While her title affirmed divine descent, her reality was administrative dependence. Negotiations with the shogunate were handled through official channels, often with the involvement of court nobles who acted as intermediaries. There was no direct line of communication between the empress and the shogun. Messages were drafted in formal language, decisions weighed in advance for political risk, and outcomes shaped by the unspoken understanding that the court must never seem assertive. When disputes arose over court protocol or ceremonial funding, they were not argued openly. Instead, they were expressed through adjustments to ritual frequency, changes in the seating of dignitaries, or delays in minor appointments. These quiet forms of protest were the only forms available. Behind the layers of ritual, Go-Sakuramachi's frustrations remained carefully veiled. There is no record of open resistance, but the shape of her reign reveals an enduring effort to preserve dignity without provocation. She continued her father's reforms of court practices, standardizing ceremonial language and preserving historical texts. She participated in the compilation of important imperial documents, reinforcing the throne's connection to tradition, even as it lacked the power to shape policy. These acts, though limited in scope, reflected a deliberate strategy to assert the throne's relevance through cultural and historical continuity, rather than direct influence. Within the palace, her role as a woman added complexity to an already restricted office. She was expected to maintain a high standard of decorum, avoid any hint of personal ambition, and accept that her reign would be temporary. The assumption persisted that once her nephew reached maturity, she would abdicate without protest. Yet until that moment arrived, she was responsible for carrying out imperial functions with the full appearance of authority, while knowing each gesture was measured against the expectations of a distant power. Her endurance lay in her ability to embody sovereignty without challenging the system that had hollowed it out. The imperial household under her reign remained small and dependent. Court nobles struggled with limited resources, and the financial support from Edo was barely sufficient to maintain the traditional calendar of events. The palace buildings showed signs of disrepair, the library collections remained underused, and many rituals had been simplified to accommodate the reduced scale of the court. Yet Go-Sakuramachi kept these traditions alive with methodical attention. She understood that the appearance of continuity mattered. not only for the legitimacy of the court, but for the cohesion of the state. Her interactions with the court aristocracy also required careful navigation. These were men born into titles they could not fully exercise, educated in rights they could no longer enforce. Resentment simmered in private writings, but few dared express it openly. Go-Sakuramachi moved among them not as a disruptor, but as a steward, preserving what remained of imperial culture while avoiding the perception of reform. It was in this restrained preservation that her reign found meaning, not in what she changed, but in what she kept from collapse. The delicate balance she maintained was not static. The political structure of the Tokugawa period allowed the throne to survive, but only by remaining ornamental. Go-Sakuramachi never overstepped, yet she never disappeared into silence. She moved carefully through ceremonies, responded to shogunate instructions without resistance, and managed court matters with an awareness that each misstep could result in increased restrictions. Her reign, early on, was an exercise in visible strength and invisible boundaries, where sovereignty was performed but never fully held. Even as Go-Sakuramachi wore the crown, the court knew her reign was not meant to endure. From the moment she ascended, the expectation was that she would eventually yield to a male heir. That heir was Prince Hidehito, her young nephew, and the only surviving son of her late brother, Emperor Momozono. Born in 1758, Hidehito was just 4 years old when she became empress. His youth placed him at the center of the dynasty's long-term survival. But it also made him a target of quiet maneuvering within a court defined by symbolic authority and internal rivalry. Go-Sakuramachi found herself in a position that was both maternal and institutional, tasked with guiding a child while protecting the legitimacy of an imperial line constantly at risk of fragmentation. As regent in all but name, she had no legal claim to guardianship beyond her role as reigning empress. Yet her proximity to the prince gave her practical influence. She oversaw his education, ensuring that he was raised within the full structure of imperial etiquette, language, and ritual. In a court where tradition held more weight than law, this upbringing mattered. It ensured that Hidehito would one day embody the continuity the system required, even if he had little political power to wield. Go-Sakuramachi's choices in his instruction were shaped by caution. She avoided reforms or instructors that might signal ideological shifts, knowing that even minor deviations could spark unease in the watchful eyes of the shogunate. Inside the palace, factionalism had never fully disappeared. Though the court lacked formal authority, its internal dynamics remained complex. Noble families still vied for prestige through ceremonial appointments and proximity to the throne. Hidehito's future reign represented the next generational alignment of these interests. Go-Sakuramachi worked quietly to insulate him from these currents, assigning his care to attendants she trusted and controlling access to his daily life. Her own influence, however, was always bounded. Every action required delicacy, too much visibility, and she risked drawing suspicion from Edo. Too little, and the boy could be pulled into alliances she could not control. The pressures of protecting an heir within a symbolic monarchy were different from those of rule in past centuries. Go-Sakuramachi was not defending a throne from military rivals or regional lords. She was defending a name, a lineage, and a fragile image of unbroken succession. The danger was not rebellion, but irrelevance. The shogunate allowed the court to function as a cultural institution, but any sign of political independence could be met with reduction in funds, interference in appointments, or further restriction on ceremonial authority. The empress understood that Hidehito's eventual accession needed to appear smooth, inevitable, and completely aligned with Tokugawa approval. Her relationship with him remained largely formal in the records, but the continuity of their lives suggests a bond shaped by shared containment. Both of them lived within a system that had narrowed imperial identity to performance. Both were watched, controlled, and used as symbols. She prepared him not for rule in the traditional sense, but for stewardship of a role defined by restraint. His upbringing emphasized precedent, deference, and the invisible politics of imperial survival. It was not power that he would inherit, but a position that required enduring relevance without provocation. As he grew, the tension within the court shifted subtly. Ministers began planning for the eventual transition. Go-Sakuramachi was aware that her time as sovereign would be finite, yet she maintained the outward dignity of reign without signaling withdrawal. Her careful management of Hidehito's image ensured that when the time came, he would be accepted not only as the rightful successor, but as the product of a stable line. That image, cultivated across years of restricted agency, would be the court's defense against further erosion. In guiding him through his early years, she was not merely preserving bloodline. She was constructing the conditions under which the throne could continue to exist. Her own position remained precarious, hemmed in by expectations of passivity and transition. But through the shadow of her nephew, she shaped the dynasty's future, not with declaration or reform, but through constant, watchful presence. Her reign was temporary by design, but the figure she shielded would carry forward what the system needed most, the illusion of permanence. Go-Sakuramachi's reign did not usher in sweeping policies or structural reforms, but it left behind a quieter imprint, one built through ritual. In the political language of her time, ceremonies were not relics of the past. They were instruments of preservation. As empress, she understood that her authority would never rival that of the shogunate. But she also knew that without active stewardship, the traditions surrounding the throne could erode into irrelevance. The rituals she led, rooted in centuries of imperial practice, became her way of asserting continuity in a system designed to keep her power ornamental. She could not issue laws or command armies, but she could control the symbolism that gave the court its remaining influence. Under her leadership, ancient rites were not merely repeated, they were reaffirmed as vital components of national identity. Seasonal festivals continued despite dwindling funds, and court music, poetry, and purification rituals retained their structured presence in palace life. Go-Sakuramachi made deliberate choices about what to preserve, which observances to prioritize, and how to maintain dignity in performance, even when the scale of events was diminished. These decisions, while appearing passive from the outside, were in fact strategic. They held the court together at a time when it risked being viewed as a ceremonial fiction. One of her most persistent efforts involved reinforcing the spiritual authority of the throne through religious alliances. The emperor had long been regarded as a divine intermediary, a position grounded in Shinto belief and maintained through ritual connection to the kami. Go-Sakuramachi ensured that this connection remained visible, participating in purification rites and shrine observances with consistency. While these acts lacked direct political utility, they sustained the impression that the emperor, however restrained, remained at the center of Japan's spiritual order. The shogunate had its own religious affiliations, particularly with major Buddhist institutions, but it still relied on the imperial family to anchor the traditional calendar of rituals that marked transitions in time, harvests, and celestial events. Her alliances with Shinto priests and select Buddhist clergy served not to challenge the Tokugawa religious order, but to maintain imperial visibility within it. She supported the continued exchange of offerings between the palace and key shrines, and she upheld the liturgical readings that traced back to earlier dynasties. These acts were neither grand nor disruptive, but their repetition mattered. In an era when many of the old institutions were under threat from neglect or bureaucratic tightening, her commitment to ritual was a form of resistance, not through confrontation, but through endurance. Within the palace itself, Go-Sakuramachi supervised the codification of ceremonial language, overseeing the copying and preservation of texts that defined imperial speech and conduct. These records, while administrative in appearance, helped safeguard the intellectual infrastructure of the monarchy. In a time when the court's access to resources was tightly regulated by the shogunate, the act of preserving knowledge became a political statement. The emperor may not govern directly, but the emperor would not forget how. Go-Sakuramachi also used ritual as a way to hold together the fragmented nobility. The great court families, while stripped of political relevance, still competed for honor and placement in ceremonial life. By preserving their roles in the established order of events, she offered them a framework for loyalty and recognition. These gestures avoided friction while reinforcing the shared stake these families had in the monarchy's survival. She did not elevate new factions or create ideological divisions. She kept what existed intact, knowing that continuity alone was now a form of stability. In the absence of military or legislative tools, these choices, ceremonial, spiritual, procedural, formed the core of her reign. Go-Sakuramachi operated within the tightest constraints, yet she ensured that the court did not collapse inward. The rituals she upheld were not symbols of past glory, but instruments of survival. Through them, the monarchy remained legible to the people, useful to the shogunate, and credible to the court. She gave the appearance of immobility, but within that stillness was a deliberate choreography, one that kept the throne upright even as its foundations shifted beneath her. In 1771, after 9 years on the throne, Go-Sakuramachi abdicated in favor of her nephew, Prince Hidehito, who took the name Emperor Go-Momozono. The transition was expected. From the start, her reign had been viewed as provisional, a necessary bridge between her brother's premature death and the maturity of his son. But the circumstances of her abdication were distinct. Unlike past rulers who stepped down into ritual seclusion or political obscurity, she remained within the palace and continued to exert quiet but significant influence. Her retreat from the throne was not a removal from power, but a redefinition of it. As a cloistered empress, or Daijō-tenno, she occupied a role that allowed her to advise, observe, and preserve court stability without directly interfering in governance. Her continued presence offered the court a measure of continuity that the fragile system depended on. Go Momozono was still a teenager when he assumed the throne. His education had been shaped under her supervision, and he carried forward the habits of deference and ceremonial precision that she had instilled. But youth brought with it new risks. The imperial institution, still reliant on symbolic performance, could not afford missteps that might provoke concern from the shogunate. Go-Sakuramachi understood the pressures her nephew would face and remained close enough to guide him through the early years of his reign without overshadowing him in public. She did not rule from behind a screen, nor did she attempt to reclaim authority. Instead, she offered what the court needed most: stability through presence. Her role as cloistered empress allowed her to maintain relationships with court ministers and nobles, continuing to shape the court's internal dynamics through subtle intervention. She had no formal authority, but her opinion held weight in appointments, ceremonial planning, and diplomatic messaging. Her familiarity with precedent gave her standing, and her prior reign gave her perspective. The court, still structured around inherited roles and formal ranks, functioned best when guided by someone who understood its limits. Go-Sakuramachi served as that guide, not by altering the system, but by holding it steady. The transition also marked a shift in how imperial retirement functioned under the Tokugawa system. In earlier centuries, retired emperors had often held more influence than reigning ones, operating through complex networks of regents and monks. By the 18th century, such arrangements were no longer feasible. The shogunate would not tolerate the appearance of divided power within the palace. Yet within those constraints, Go-Sakuramachi found a way to remain involved. She avoided confrontation, spoke through ritual rather than instruction, and ensured that her nephew's reign aligned with the careful stability she had worked to preserve. Her retirement also allowed her to focus on cultural preservation. With fewer public obligations, she turned her attention to maintaining the court's literary and ceremonial records. She supported the continued copying of classical texts, the refinement of ritual manuals, and the careful archiving of imperial proceedings. These activities, while not visible to the public, sustained the intellectual infrastructure of the monarchy. In doing so, she secured a foundation upon which Go Momozono could build his reign, one grounded in memory, tradition, and institutional rhythm. Within the palace walls, her continued involvement reinforced the idea that abdication did not mean disappearance. She was still addressed with honor, still consulted in moments of uncertainty, and still seen as the guardian of imperial form. Go Momozono's reign would be shaped in part by her silent proximity, a reminder that sovereignty, in this period, was as much about preserving balance as it was about leading change. Her withdrawal from the throne, carefully managed and symbolically precise, became another act of continuity. She had not claimed power, and she would not relinquish purpose. Through that balance, she remained central to the court's function, even after stepping aside. Emperor Go Momozono's reign began under the careful watch of his aunt, but it did not unfold with the stability the court had hoped for. From his accession in 1771, the young emperor's rule was marked by fragility, not of politics or policy, but of lineage. The imperial family had long faced difficulties in maintaining a direct line of succession, and Go Momozono's health soon became a source of growing concern. Within a few short years, signs of illness began to shadow his presence, and the hope of a long, uninterrupted reign began to fade. As the emperor weakened, so did the court's confidence in the future of the dynasty. The imperial line, though steeped in centuries of continuity, had no guarantee of survival without an heir. And in this uncertain moment, Go-Sakuramachi stepped again into the role she had never entirely relinquished, protector of the throne's continuity. Despite her formal retirement, she remained acutely aware of the court's precarious position. The emperor had only one daughter, born in 1771, and no surviving sons. The succession laws had grown increasingly rigid under Tokugawa supervision, and the court had little room to maneuver without risking interference or outright rejection from the shogunate. Go-Sakuramachi understood that the threat facing the dynasty was not just personal tragedy, but institutional collapse. If no suitable heir could be found, the shogunate might propose a distant relative, weaken the court's authority further, or reconfigure the succession altogether. The symbolism of unbroken lineage would be fractured, and with it, the court's last source of legitimacy. As Momozono's health declined more visibly in 1779, the need for action became urgent. Go-Sakuramachi worked behind the scenes with court ministers to explore succession options that would preserve the core of the imperial line while satisfying the Tokugawa demand for stability. It was not a question of will, but of procedure. How to present a solution that would appear seamless, unquestionable, and legitimate within both the court and the shogunate. The negotiations had to be carried out in silence, and the choice had to be made quickly. With no sons of his own, Momozono agreed to adopt a successor from a collateral branch of the imperial family. That boy, Prince Morohito, was the son of Prince Sukehito from the Kanin branch, a lineage with historical ties to the throne, but distant enough to raise concern if not carefully presented. Go-Sakuramachi took the lead in ensuring the adoption was completed before Momozono's death. The process, while internal to the court, required coordination with shogunate officials who would need to accept the selection and approve the transition. It was a delicate operation, handled through formal language and ritualized procedure. Every decision was framed as adherence to precedent, even as it pushed against the edge of allowable improvisation. Her experience, her credibility, and her familiarity with imperial forms made her the only figure capable of guiding the succession through this moment without visible fracture. The emperor died in December 1779, just days after the adoption was finalized. The new heir, Prince Morohito, would ascend the throne as Emperor Kokaku the following year. The transition appeared smooth to those outside the court, but it had been narrowly secured. The monarchy had come close to rupture, and it was Go-Sakuramachi's intervention that prevented it. Her role, though never publicly declared, was central. She had acted as guardian not only of a child or a ritual, but of a dynasty on the verge of interruption. This was not the power of decree or command. It was the influence of memory, presence, and timing. In a system where symbolism carried more weight than law, her ability to navigate the rules without appearing to rewrite them made the difference. She preserved the line not through force, but through precision. And in doing so, she held together more than a succession. She held together the illusion that the imperial house had never faltered. In the final months of 1779, as Emperor Momozono's health declined past the point of recovery, The question of succession returned with sudden urgency. With no male heir of his own, and only a young daughter still too far removed from imperial precedent to be considered, the court faced the very real possibility of a break in the imperial line. Such a rupture would not only violate centuries of perceived continuity, but risked inviting direct interference from the Tokugawa shogunate. The system that held the court in place depended on the image of unbroken succession. Without it, the shogunate could question the need for the court itself. In this moment of institutional crisis, Go-Sakuramachi acted with quiet decisiveness. Though cloistered and technically retired, she held the memory, authority, and access needed to move without hesitation where others faltered. The adoption of Prince Morohito from the Kanin branch of the imperial family was not a spontaneous solution. The idea had circulated in hushed conversations among senior courtiers who understood that succession by blood alone could not always be guaranteed. The Kanin line, descended from Emperor Higashiyama, held enough proximity to legitimacy, but no adoption of such nature could proceed without risk. A boy from another branch carried with him not only new blood, but new allegiances. Factions within the court hesitated. Some feared the precedent, others worried about loyalty, and beneath it all, there remained a silent resistance to the idea of Go-Sakuramachi, a woman no longer reigning, determining the shape of future rule. Yet the moment left no room for delay. Go-Sakuramachi moved through the formal layers of imperial protocol to ensure that Morohito was adopted while the emperor still lived, thus binding the transition in legitimacy. She ensured that the necessary rituals were performed in time, and that the language of succession maintained the appearance of unbroken lineage. The formal documentation cast the adoption not as an emergency measure, but as a continuation of imperial will. The process was wrapped in the correct ceremonial order, leaving no room for dispute. Even the shogunate, informed after the fact but not invited to obstruct, accepted the transition without protest. The speed of her action left no vacuum for alternative suggestions. This was not simply an act of administrative efficiency. It was a demonstration of influence, built on knowledge of timing, structure, and precedent. Go-Sakuramachi understood that the survival of the monarchy required flexibility concealed within formality. The choice of Prince Morohito satisfied both the internal need for lineage and the external demand for stability. His youth ensured that he could be shaped by the court, but his adoption before Momozono's death ensured that the shogunate could not block the transfer without appearing to question the throne itself. Still, the decision marked a boundary. Go-Sakuramachi had intervened where few women were ever allowed to move. She had preserved the dynasty through a personal act of political maneuvering that would not be permitted again. The rules were tightening. The shogunate, though passive in this instance, would grow increasingly cautious of imperial deviation in the years to follow. And within the court itself, the idea of a woman serving as reigning empress or guardian of succession would gradually close. Her actions, though successful, quietly triggered the recognition that such autonomy was no longer acceptable. She would live to see the boy she adopted become Emperor Kokaku, and she would remain in the palace as a stabilizing figure during the early years of his reign. But her moment of direct influence had passed. It had come at the edge of possibility and had been exercised with such precision that it left no trace of open challenge. Still, it lingered. The monarchy survived, not through inevitability, but through her decision. And in that decision lay a silent conclusion. She had been the last woman to determine an emperor. The system would not allow another. In the years following Emperor Kokaku's accession, Go-Sakuramachi faded from public view, but not from influence. She no longer occupied the throne, issued decrees, or oversaw matters of succession. Yet her presence remained embedded in the court's rhythm. As a cloistered empress, now removed from decision-making, she became a figure of silent guidance, rarely named, but never entirely absent. The rituals she had safeguarded during her reign continued under her watchful eye. Court ceremonies were observed with precision, and the spiritual order of the palace remained intact, shaped by the standards she had preserved through decades of containment. Emperor Kokaku, still young at the time of his enthronement, represented a dynasty preserved through her action, though he would later grow into a ruler who sought modest reforms and projected a vision of cultural stewardship. His early reign was anchored by the continuity Go-Sakuramachi had secured. She did not interfere in his rule, nor act as a shadow sovereign, but she remained an elder whose knowledge of precedent and form was indispensable to the court. Her role in the background, advising, interpreting, observing, ensured that tradition did not slip into disuse during a period when the court risked further marginalization. Within the palace, she became a stabilizing presence, occupying rooms that held memory more than authority. Those who served her did so with reverence, not because she held power, but because she had carried it when no one else could. Her silence was not the silence of retreat. It was the result of a lifetime spent inside the edges of what the system allowed. Even in retirement, she understood the limits placed on her voice. To speak openly would have drawn attention to the rare exception she represented, a woman who had ruled. Instead, she remained a living reminder of what the court had once permitted and would never permit again. As time passed, the story of her reign began to recede from formal memory. The court did not celebrate her contributions in proclamations or monuments. Her role in securing the adoption of Emperor Kokaku was acknowledged privately, but not preserved in official record as a decisive moment. The system had depended on her, but it could not afford to remember her fully. She had acted within precedent, but stretched it to its final boundary. In a structure built on repetition and hierarchy, the existence of a reigning empress, especially one who protected succession and made sovereign decisions, was treated as a temporary necessity, not a legacy to enshrine. This quiet erasure did not diminish her impact, but it shaped how she lived in the years that followed. Go-Sakuramachi continued to participate in religious observances, supported the maintenance of imperial archives, and received visits from high-ranking courtiers. Her life remained confined to the palace complex, yet she stood as a witness to the passing of generations, the restructuring of court alliances, and the slow, managed decline of imperial influence. She had lived through the reigns of her father, her brother, her nephew, and now the boy she had brought to the throne. Her silence bore the weight of all those transitions. She died in 1813 at the age of 73, after more than 4 decades of shaping and sustaining the monarchy from within its walls. Her funeral was carried out with appropriate ceremony, but her name did not rise in political discourse or historical reckoning. She was not condemned, but she was not elevated. The court had survived because of her, yet it could not fully acknowledge her place. To do so would be to admit that power had once been placed in hands the system was designed to exclude. Go-Sakuramachi left behind no heirs, no edicts, and no successors in form. She left only memory, contained, restricted, and slowly absorbed into the silence that followed her reign. Go-Sakuramachi died in 1813, having ruled and guided the imperial court through one of its most fragile periods. Official records remembered her as calm, unremarkable, even passive. But behind that quiet exterior was a reign that held the monarchy together when it could have fractured. She stepped onto the throne not to wield power, but to preserve it. She accepted a role no one else could take, held it without scandal, and ensured a peaceful transition when her nephew came of age. Years later, when that same nephew lay dying without a male heir, it was she who arranged the adoption that preserved the imperial line. These were not grand reforms or public acts of leadership, but they were irreversible. Her influence rested in subtlety. She remained within the palace for decades after abdication, offering quiet guidance, ensuring ritual continuity, and protecting the image of imperial stability. Her decisions were designed not to draw attention, and because they worked, she was written out of the center of the story. Her reign did not challenge the balance of power. It protected it. She did not push against the system. She mastered it from within. But history does not always remember quiet preservation. She was the last woman to reign, and no one followed her. After her, the law closed that door. The court never elevated another empress regnant, and her legacy faded into official silence. She protected a throne that would forget her, and a system that could not name her without admitting how much it owed. What do you think? Was she a savior or a shadow ruler?